Hey everybody, this is Samantha with Prairie Pioneers. I'm really excited to share with you guys about how our first week doing the Three Rivers Challenge has gone. It was a pretty good week. Nothing too scary as far as meal planning. It was a short week. We did start the challenge on Monday, and so we only have Monday through Friday to report on. So in those 5 days though, I packed in quite a bit of different meal prep and things like that. One thing I will preface by saying is that we did not do, I didn't film like our breakfasts because typically we don't have breakfast, like a big breakfast. It's usually just cereal or porridge or something like that. So I usually have a cup of coffee and the kids and my husband eat some cereal. So nothing too fancy there. And most of our lunches were also sandwiches, so you won't see much of that either. But we did have a breakfast for dinner, some pancakes and sausages. So here we go. I'll let you guys check out this week's meals. Monday we had sandwiches for lunch, nothing super fancy there. Then for dinner I made spaghetti with my home canned meat sauce. Unfortunately, I didn't think to video that because I guess it seemed like something that most people would know how to make, but I will show you a jar of my home canned meat sauce. My mom and I pressure canned this back in the fall. If you'd like the recipe, I will link the canning book I got it from in the description. Tuesday was a little bit more exciting. Though we had sandwiches for lunch again, we made homemade sausages and sourdough pancakes for dinner. I started off by making 2 batches of breakfast sausages. I tweaked the original recipe just a little bit using 2.5 pounds of ground pork instead of just 2 pounds. My family originally thought that it was just a little bit too spicy. So next I added 2 teaspoons of ground sage, 4 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of black pepper, an 1/8 teaspoon of nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon of ground coriander, 1/2 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, and then lastly, 2.5 tablespoons of maple syrup. Mix that up really well. I am using this Pampered Chef patty maker and my scale to portion out the patties. Each patty is going to be somewhere between 60 and 65 grams. This recipe happened to make 19 patties. I then put these on some parchment paper and put them in the freezer on a flat surface just to like pre-freeze them and then put them into vacuum seal bags. Next, I put together the sourdough pancake dough to ferment. To start, I'm putting a little bit of kombucha in the bowl and then adding milk to get the 454 grams of buttermilk that the recipe called for. You can use vinegar instead of the kombucha. I just happen to have a lot of kombucha on hand, so I decided to use that. We're going to stir this really well and then add in our 227 grams of sourdough starter. And 28 grams of sugar. This sourdough starter can be discarded. It does not have to be fed or active because we are going to let it sit and ferment and become active. And lastly, we're going to put in 240 grams of flour. We're going to mix this really well and then leave it to rest covered for about 10 hours. It's a good idea to make this the night before if you want it for breakfast, or early in the morning if you plan to have it for dinner. And unfortunately, it seems that I forgot to record, but right before you cook it, we're going to add 2 more eggs, a 1/4 cup of oil, 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt, and a teaspoon of baking soda to the mix, and then it'll get like super bubbly. Here I'm just putting my breakfast sausage patties and pancakes onto the griddle. We served this meal with home canned strawberry top syrup and some home canned apple cider that we made from our crab apples that my brother and sister-in-law have. Wednesday, we had leftovers for lunch and sandwiches for dinner because I spent the rest of the day working on baking sourdough bread and crackers. To make the bread, I started off by feeding my starter the day before. I wait until it has risen and started to fall before I use it. This recipe calls for 65 grams of active starter and 300 grams of warm water. So the warm water should be what we call blood temperature. So it's basically the same temperature as your skin or your body temperature, between 90 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm now adding 56 grams of sugar, and we're just going to stir that all up until it's dissolved. Next, we'll add 500 grams of flour, which seems like a lot of flour. And then we'll add 20 grams of oil and 9 grams of salt. We'll stir it all together and then mix it by hand just until the flour is incorporated. It's still going to be quite sticky, but you don't want it runny, if that makes sense. It's still going to stick to your fingers, but you want to make sure that the flour gets incorporated and it's not too wet. You might have to add or subtract a little bit of flour. If you don't know what your hydration rates are, I would recommend starting with less flour and working your way up to the 500 grams, just so that you are sure on what you use. I've done this recipe a few times now, and so I knew that I pretty much needed exactly 500 grams. We're going to place a damp towel over this and let it rest for 30 to 45 minutes. When we come back, we're going to do what's called a stretch and fold. We're going to do 4 of them. So we do this by first getting the dough out of your bowl and then grabbing one edge of the dough and pulling or stretching it upwards, then folding it back on itself. You're going to do that 4 times to each of the corners, shall we call them. Then place the damp towel back over it and let it rest for the rest of the day. Then in the evening, I come back and I roll the dough into logs. So I pull it out of the bowl, lay it flat or like kind of squish it flat on my countertop, and then roll it up like a burrito. And I'm gonna place that in an oiled bread pan and then cover again with another damp towel and leave that rest until the next morning. So the next morning, this is what the bread looks like. And I'm going to then put it in the oven and bake it at 375 degrees for exactly 40 minutes. And then we have the most beautiful sandwich bread that you could possibly ask for. While that dough was rising all day, I decided to make a couple of batches of crackers. I'm going to start off with my fishy crackers for my toddler. I have adapted this recipe from Better Homes and Garden to suit our needs. We start off with 120 grams of flour, and to that I am going to add 9 grams of table salt and then 42 grams of cheese powder. This cheese powder is the same kind of powder that you would get in macaroni and cheese. I just buy it in bulk separately. Next, we're going to add 3 tablespoons of oil and then 210 grams of starter. This can be discard. I'm just using up some of the rest of my active starter that I had from that morning making the bread. Go ahead and mix well until all of those ingredients are well incorporated. And then I'm going to wrap it in plastic wrap, and we are going to set it aside for at least 1 hour. Next, I'm going to make the garlic and herb crackers. This one my husband and I prefer, and it's a little bit less work than the fishy crackers. So we're going to start off with 120 grams of flour again, and then I'm adding garlic and dill. I don't have exact measurements on those. I'm just measuring with my heart. Not an exact science on that one. Then I'm going to add my 9 grams of salt, 210 grams of starter, and 3 tablespoons of oil. Now, you could really have a lot of fun with this recipe and change up the seasoning ingredients. The original recipe that I am going off of actually has some seeds in it. So that's an option as well if you have that on hand or if your family enjoys that. I just picked out a couple of recipes that our family enjoyed. This one was originally intended to be more of a ranch cracker because we really enjoy the ranch Cheez-Its. But I wouldn't say it's exactly a ranch flavor, but it is very yummy. So there we go. Again, you're going to mix that well until it's good and combined, and then we're going to cover it up with plastic wrap. Alternatively, you can just cover them with a damp towel. I just wrap them with plastic wrap to make sure I don't get any dry portions on my dough because that won't work in later. Now, to roll out the crackers, I like to use my pasta machine. Starting with the garlic and herb, I'm going to cut it into 8 pieces, and then I will run each piece through my pasta machine from setting 1 all the way up to setting 5. Adding flour as is absolutely necessary because I don't want to add too much flour to this. Just enough to keep it from sticking to the machine as I go. Next, I'll place it on parchment on a pan and then use this little pie cutter tool that I have. I think it's for making pie crusts originally. It is also Pampered Chef. And just cutting that into small squares, and then I will will sprinkle with a little bit of flaky salt and bake at 300 degrees for approximately 15 minutes. Depending on your oven, I would recommend checking on them beginning at like 10 minutes, and then maybe it could take up to about 18 minutes, again, depending on your oven. As soon as they start to brown, I pull them out. Now we are working on the goldfish. These I only roll to setting 4 instead of 5 on my pasta machine. It just makes them slightly thicker, which I find is just the perfect size for the fishy crackers. So I have this little cookie cutter basically that I bought on Amazon. I put them out onto a platter and bake them. They are baked at 310 degrees for about 15 minutes. Thursday was sandwiches for lunch and cheesy broccoli soup for dinner. I started off by putting a chicken carcass in a pot and covering it with water. This was just left over from a rotisserie chicken. Then I let it boil for about an hour to an hour and a half, drained off the liquid and put it back into the pot. Next, I cut up a big bag of broccoli. Nice thing about making soup is that it isn't an exact science, so I just kind of add whatever and however much I want. And what I have on hand. So we put the broccoli back into the pot and then turn the heat back on. I'm gonna let this cook for a bit, adding some seasoning salt and some garlic powder. I cut up some leftover pieces of chicken that I had from that rotisserie chicken, and I'm gonna throw that in as well. If you wanted to can this, now would be a great time to throw it into jars and put it in the canner. The chicken and broccoli and stock can all be pressure canned. Now I am adding milk just to fill up the pot the rest of the way. I happen to have 2 open jars of Cheese Whiz in our fridge, so I decided to use one up as the cheese product in this soup. And next I'm going to pull out a ladle full of the soup and add about 2 tablespoons of cornstarch. Mix it really good, make sure you don't have any clumps, and then I will return that to the soup to help it thicken. And just let it simmer until it's whatever thickness you like. And then we served this with the homemade sourdough bread and butter. Lastly, on Friday, we had leftovers for lunch and then went over to a friend's house for dinner. So I don't really have any meals to show for that. I did can up some chicken, but I'll upload that as a separate video just because there's a lot that goes into that and it wasn't really part of our meals this week. So yeah, we had a really great week doing the 3 Rivers Challenge. I think it was a success and I can't wait to see you guys next week for week 2.